This is Professor John Mack, and I am greeting you in order to talk to you a little bit about Darwin and how it is that we need to understand Darwin, a little background to Darwin so that as you read Darwin and think about the significance of Darwin, you're sort of aimed in the right direction to understand the implications and the significance of Darwin for the development of the modern world. I have shared with you before that there are a few thinkers in history who are significant enough in terms of the ideas that they present that we can speak of a pre-person world and a post-person world. I suggested that was true of Descartes, that there is a pre-Descartian way of thinking and a post-Descartian way of thinking. I'm going to suggest to you that there is a pre-Darwinian way of thinking and a post-Darwinian way of thinking. And I would also say that there's a pre-Freudian way of thinking and a post-Freudian way of thinking, and other authors that we could name and talk about that have been so important in terms of what they present that they really do change the way in which human beings in the modern world think. Of course, having said that, understand that from a historical perspective, we are picking one person who is part of a larger group of people who are dealing with these ideas. So Darwin ultimately ends up being the person we talk about, but Darwin is not the only one at this time period to be developing these ideas and developing these ways of thinking. But he becomes then the focal point because of the publication of his book, Origin of Species, and because then he really does become that central figure in this reimagining nature and the way in which we think about nature. And again, the significance of Darwin, as I have suggested before, is not found primarily in the initial stages of the Darwinian sort of approach. It's not found in what Darwin has to say about human beings. Darwin is very careful in his book Origin of Species not to engage the question of origin of human beings. So what is significant about Darwin, what is incredibly challenging as Darwin presents his theory, is not his view of human origins, but rather his view of nature. And to understand that, we need to move on and talk about sort of pre-Darwinian thinking and the way in which people before Darwin thought about nature so that we can understand how it is that Darwin critiques and offers a counter view of nature and see the significance of that counter view. To me, the best way to do this, to sort of simply present the pre-Darwinian way of thinking about nature, is to use writings from the great medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas and his Summa Theologica. Now, I have chosen 4 quotes from the Summa Theologica which do summarize Aquinas' view on nature that is the dominant view of nature in a pre-Darwinian world. So let's look briefly at these quotes and sort of deduce or extract from them what Aquinas is saying about nature in order to understand the way in which pre-Darwinian people were thinking about nature, so that then we can understand the significance of Darwin himself. The first quote: "Everything in nature reflects the order by which God directs it through nature for its own benefit." Now, as you look at that quote, you'll notice a few things. First of all, the emphasis on order. So what pre-Darwinian thinking suggested is that nature is orderly, that there is an order to nature. Secondly, notice that it says God is directing nature, so that the order you see in nature is a result of God's activity in nature. Extremely important. Nature and the order we see in nature reflects the divine intervention in nature, and the divine intervention in nature is for the best benefit, or for the best sort of result for that everything, for that creature that God is directing, and that God is intervening. So that God is overruling nature. It's the doctrine of providence. That everything that happens in nature is a reflection of the divine will, and everything that happens in nature has a meaning or purpose, and that meaning and purpose is the good of the person or creature to which things are happening. So God orders nature for good. All right? And that is one of the presuppositions of a pre-Darwinian way of thinking. Everything has a purpose. Everything has a meaning. God either allows things to happen or causes things to happen, but either way is intimately involved in what happens, so that his purpose and his plan for nature, society, humanity is fulfilled. All right, quote number 2. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. So there again is this teleological understanding of nature, that everything that happens in nature happens for a purpose. And this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Again, what happens in nature happens for a purpose or reason, and that is a good purpose or reason. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously but designedly do they, that is, these things that lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, they achieve the end for which they, Thomas Aquinas would add, were created. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end. And of course, borrowing from the ancient Greeks, Thomas Aquinas would assert that the only creature that has intelligence or rationality is the human being. So here he's talking about all mammals and fish and birds and anything in nature that does not have intelligence, so cannot make free will choices, but nevertheless is acting towards an end. He's saying whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards that end unless it is directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now this is the classical, what I call the watchmaker argument for the existence of God. If you found a watch in the street, you knew nothing about watches or knew nothing about where it came from, but if you looked at that watch and you looked through it and saw how intricate and designed it was and how everything works together to achieve the end of telling time, the one thing you could conclude from looking at that watch is that somebody made that watch, because it couldn't have happened that way by chance. So if we look at nature and we see that everything happens for a purpose and everything works together and everything is orderly, then we can conclude by looking at nature that of necessity there must be some maker. There must be some orderer. There must be someone who created nature. Therefore, we can assert that God exists. All right? Next quote, since nature works for a determinate end, notice there the teleological emphasis, and under the direction of a higher agent, whatever is done by nature must needs be traced back to God as its first cause. Again, God is actively involved in what happens in the natural world, including what happens in the lives of human beings, so that the first cause of everything that happens in nature, of which human beings are a part, is we must think of God as its first cause. Now, Aquinas is going to make a distinction between, God's active will and God's permissive will, so that even though God is the first cause, he cannot be, judged for negative things that happen in his notion of theodicy, or the defense of God against the accusation that if he's totally in charge, then he creates evil. But what's important in this quote is this idea that there is a determinate end. So here we have teleology again. God is active in nature, directing nature for a particular purpose, which is the purpose he has chosen for nature, and God is the first cause of everything that happens. All right, last quote. It is evident that all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted on them. All things, everything in nature then, reflects the eternal law of God. And the law of God is imprinted on nature itself. Wherefore it, that is nature, has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature, now he's talking about human beings, is called the natural law. Now that is incredibly important for Thomas Aquinas' ethics and this whole notion of natural law ethics. For our purposes, it is sufficient to see that what he is saying is, if nature reflects God's goal for nature, if nature and the order in nature is a reflection of God as first cause, then we can deduce from nature certain moral truths that are reflective of God's design, not only for irrational beings, but also for rational beings, which is this notion of natural law. So, if we think about then this pre-Darwinian view of nature, it is nature is, and let me click then to this last slide so we can pull this up. Nature is, and it's on this section here on the left, nature is ordered and reveals purpose and meaning. The order of nature indicates the existence of an orderer, and the fact that nature reflects God's design means that we can look to nature to understand God's will for human beings, natural law ethics. That is the essence of a pre-Darwinian view of the world. All right, that if a tragic event happens to me, I can rest assured that whatever may be the sort of what I see in it, behind it there is the will of God, and since God only wants what's good for me, then I know that it happened for a reason and it happened for a purpose. All right, we see this reflected in our world all the time. When things bad happen, well, it happened for a reason. It happened for a purpose. There's a meaning to this. That's a pre-Darwinian way of thinking about nature. All right, secondly, this notion that we can argue from nature and use nature as a proof for the existence of God. And then thirdly, that nature reveals some of God's will for human beings in terms of their behavior. Now let me briefly sort of give an example or two of this last point. Then I will close this recording and do a new recording in terms of what Darwin says in response to this. All right, first of all, a good example of this would be to look at the order of gender. Now, of course, in the pre-Darwinian world, there was a very limited understanding of the natural world. Most of the species that we now know exist, they did not understand or know existed. But taken their view and their knowledge of what existed in the natural world, it was not uncommon for people to say, look at the natural world and see how male animals are in charge. Male animals are the ones, who rule the pride, if you will. The male lion, although he doesn't work as hard as the female lion, he's the guy who calls the shots, if you want to use that kind of expression. And females then are subordinate, males are in charge and perform leadership roles. Therefore, God's order for society and for the human family must be that men are in charge and women are subordinate. All right, that's one argument. A similar argument could be made about homosexuality. Of course, they didn't know about, bisexual monkeys or homosexual penguins, so they would have argued in nature you see animals. First of all, they're heterosexual. Secondly, the purpose of sex in nature is always procreation. You don't see a dog putting on a condom, for instance. So therefore, the purpose in sex in the human world must be, first of all, procreation. So any use of sex for non-procreative purposes is wrong. And secondly, it must always be heterosexual.